I thought the worst thing I'd come home to was the silence. After 14 months overseas, all I wanted was to stand on my land again, the 22 acres I'd spent years paying for before deployment. The place wasn't fancy. Just a stretch of timber, a small pond, and enough room to build the future I'd been planning since my 20s. Instead, I found construction equipment, fresh concrete, brand new fencing, and 3 luxury garages sitting on my property. At first, I honestly thought I had the wrong address. Then I saw the survey markers. My survey markers. Someone hadn't just crossed the property line. They'd built an entire private storage complex nearly 70 feet onto my land. The HOA president was standing there giving orders like she owned the place. When I confronted her, she smiled and said something I'll never forget. "You were gone. Nobody was using it." What she didn't know was that before deployment, I'd quietly updated every survey, deed record, and title document connected to the property. And what she definitely didn't know was that every single day those buildings remained on my land would soon cost her association thousands of dollars. But before I could send the invoice that changed everything, I uncovered a secret that was far bigger than trespassing. If you've ever dealt with entitled neighbors or HOA abuse, hit subscribe and let me know what you'd have done. Most people think coming home from deployment is about seeing family, sleeping in their own bed, or finally enjoying a decent meal that doesn't come from a military dining facility. For me, it was about seeing my land again. 22 acres of it. Nothing fancy. No mansion. No expensive buildings. Just a piece of property I had spent years saving for, years planning around, and years imagining as the place where I'd eventually build my future. I bought it when I was 32. At that point in my life, I was tired of temporary addresses. Military service had taken me all over the country and overseas. Every few years, there was a new assignment, a new place to live, and a new routine to learn. Most of my adult life fit inside storage units, duffel bags, and moving trucks. I wanted something permanent, something that belonged to me no matter where the military sent me next. So I started saving, not because I had some grand investment plan. I simply wanted a place where nobody could tell me what color to paint a building, what vehicle I could park outside, or how I was supposed to live. When I found the property, I knew it was exactly what I had been looking for. The previous owner had divided a larger parcel and put part of it up for sale. Most buyers ignored it because it wasn't fully developed. There were thick trees, uneven terrain, and plenty of work required before anything could be built. That didn't bother me. I actually preferred it that way. Every improvement would be mine. Every project would have a purpose. Every inch would reflect the life I wanted to build after my military career ended. Whenever I had leave, I spent time there. I cleared brush, marked future building locations, maintained access paths. Sometimes I'd bring a folding chair and simply sit near the pond for a few hours. There wasn't much to look at. That was the point. The silence was worth more to me than any expensive vacation. Over time, I developed a clear vision for the property. A modest cabin. A workshop. Enough space to enjoy privacy without being isolated. Nothing extravagant. Just a place that felt like home. Then came the deployment orders. The military doesn't care about personal timelines. When orders arrive, you go. So I shifted my attention toward preparing for departure. I made sure property taxes were paid automatically. Updated insurance records. Organized copies of important documents. A friend who lived nearby agreed to occasionally check on the land whenever he was in the area. There wasn't much else to do. The property didn't have structures that needed constant maintenance. It simply needed time. And I expected it would be waiting exactly as I left it. The only concern in the back of my mind involved the subdivision bordering one side of the property. Unlike my land, that neighborhood operated under a homeowners association. Technically, the HOA had no authority over me. My property wasn't part of their development and never had been. Most people accepted that fact without issue. One person didn't. The HOA president. I'd met her a few times before deployment, and every conversation followed the same pattern. She asked questions that weren't really questions. She offered suggestions that sounded more like instructions. And she seemed unusually bothered by the fact that someone owned land nearby without answering to the association. At first, I dismissed it as harmless annoyance. Some people simply like being in control. As long as she stayed on her side of the property line, it wasn't my problem. Or at least that's what I believed at the time. A few weeks later, I deployed overseas. Months turned into more months. Work consumed nearly all of my attention, but every now and then I'd pull up old photos of the property on my phone. The pond, the tree line, the clearing where I planned to build. Those pictures reminded me why I was working so hard in the first place. Eventually, 14 months passed. my deployment ended. I boarded a flight home knowing that the first free day I had would be spent visiting the property. I couldn't wait to stand there again, to see the same trees, the same open space, the same future waiting where I'd left it. The next morning, I loaded my gear into my truck and headed toward the land. The drive felt familiar, comforting. Every mile brought me closer to the place I'd been thinking about for over a year. Then I rounded the final bend in the road, and immediately realized something was wrong. The moment I rounded that final bend, my foot eased off the accelerator. Something felt wrong. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. The road was the same. The tree line looked familiar. Even the weather seemed perfect, with sunlight spilling across the fields and reflecting off the pond in the distance. Then I noticed something sticking above the trees. A roof. A large one. I frowned. That didn't make sense. There weren't supposed to be any structures visible from the road. I slowed down even more. As my truck moved forward, more of the structure came into view. Then another. And another. My stomach tightened. For a second, I genuinely wondered whether I'd somehow taken a wrong turn. I had spent years memorizing every corner of that property. I knew exactly what belonged there and what didn't. Those buildings definitely didn't. The closer I got, the worse it became. What initially looked like one structure turned out to be multiple detached garages lined up in a row. Fresh metal siding reflected the sunlight. Newly poured concrete driveways cut across areas that had once been covered by natural vegetation. I pulled onto the shoulder and stared. Nothing about what I was seeing made sense. I shut off the engine and stepped out. The silence that usually defined the property was gone. Instead, I heard machinery, power tools, construction noise, voices. I stood there for several seconds trying to process what I was looking at. Then my eyes found something even more disturbing. A fence. A brand new fence. It stretched across land that I knew belonged to me. My pulse immediately accelerated. I started walking. Fast. As I approached the fence line, more changes became visible. Several mature trees had been removed. Fresh landscaping had been installed. Decorative shrubs lined portions of the property. Gravel paths connected the garages to newly constructed parking areas. Someone hadn't simply wandered onto my land. They had redesigned part of it, like they owned it. I stopped near the fence and looked toward the area where one of my original survey markers should have been. Years earlier, a licensed survey crew had placed permanent monuments around the property boundaries. I remembered exactly where one of them was located, or at least where it should have been. The marker wasn't visible. That immediately raised alarms. I walked further along the fence until I found another location where a monument had been installed. This one was still there, partially buried but intact. I knelt down and brushed away dirt. There it was, exactly where I remembered. And according to that marker, the fence wasn't near the property line. It was well inside my property. I pulled out my phone. Before deployment, I'd stored survey coordinates, property documents, and GPS records digitally. At the time, it had simply seemed like good organization. Now it felt like one of the smartest decisions I'd ever made. I opened the survey file and compared the coordinates. Then I checked my GPS location. The result wasn't even close. The fence had crossed significantly onto my land. I checked again. Same answer. A third time. Same answer. By now there was no doubt. Someone had knowingly built beyond the legal boundary. I continued walking. The deeper I moved into the area, the worse the encroachment appeared. The garages sat where open ground used to be. Part of the new driveway occupied land that belonged to me. Even sections of the landscaping crossed onto my property. Every step revealed another violation. I felt anger building with each discovery. Not because of the money. Not yet. Because of the disrespect. Nobody had contacted me. Nobody had requested permission. Nobody had attempted to negotiate. Someone had simply decided they could take what wasn't theirs. I returned to my truck and pulled up county property maps. The county GIS system showed the same boundary lines that existed before deployment. Nothing had changed. No transfers. No easements. No recorded agreements. Legally, the property remained exactly as I left it, which meant the people responsible couldn't blame outdated records. The information had been available the entire time. As I stood there reviewing the maps, I noticed movement near the garages. A woman was walking toward me, confident, purposeful, and instantly familiar, the HOA president. She wasn't surprised to see me. If anything, she looked annoyed, like I'd interrupted her day. When she reached the fence, she folded her arms. "Can I help you?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. Not because of the words, because of the tone. She sounded like I was the one trespassing. This is my property, I said. Her expression barely changed. She glanced toward the garages before looking back at me. There's been some confusion regarding the boundary. Confusion. I almost laughed. The survey markers weren't confused. The county maps weren't confused. The GPS coordinates weren't confused. Only one person seemed confused, and she was standing directly in front of me. I pointed toward the garages. How long have those been there? A while. A while? I repeated. She shrugged. The association approved improvements for the neighborhood. The association? Not the owner. Not the county. Not the property holder. The association? The way she said it made it sound like the HOA possessed authority over everything it could see. I asked the question I already knew the answer to. Did anyone contact me? No. Her response came instantly. No hesitation. No apology. Nothing. Just no. Then she added something that instantly revealed exactly how she viewed the situation. You were gone. I stared at her. She continued. The land wasn't being used. For several seconds I simply looked at her. That statement told me more than any document ever could. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a survey error. This wasn't a misunderstanding. She genuinely believed my absence reduced my ownership rights, as if deployment somehow erased legal boundaries, as if leaving temporarily meant abandoning property. People like her treated rules as weapons. When rules benefited them, they enforced them aggressively. When rules stood in their way, they ignored them completely. I could see it in the confidence she carried. The assumption that nobody would challenge her decisions, the certainty that she would ultimately get her way. Then she delivered one final comment. If the lines were so important, maybe they should have been clearer. I looked directly at the survey monument sitting a short distance away, the one that had existed long before construction began, the one visible to anyone willing to look. At that moment, the final piece clicked into place. They knew. Maybe not every resident, maybe not every contractor, but someone knew. The boundary wasn't unclear. The ownership wasn't uncertain. The construction hadn't happened because of confusion. It happened because someone believed they could get away with it. And judging by the confidence in her voice, they'd been getting away with it for months. Then I learned something that made the situation even worse. The garages hadn't been built recently. The HOA board had approved the entire project nearly 8 months earlier. 8 months. 8 months of construction. 8 months of decisions. 8 months of people acting like my property belonged to them. Standing there, staring at those buildings, I realized my return home had just become something very different. Because this wasn't going to be a simple conversation, it was going to be a fight. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those garages sitting on my property. The image replayed over and over in my head. The fence, the concrete, the HOA president's expression. Most of all, her confidence. People don't act that comfortable unless they believe they're protected. That bothered me more than the construction itself. The next morning, I decided to stop speculating and start gathering facts. By 8 o'clock, I was walking into the county records office. The building looked exactly the same as I remembered. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A few employees worked behind counters while residents shuffled through paperwork and permit requests. I headed straight for the records department. The woman at the desk asked what I needed. I gave her my parcel number. A few minutes later, I was sitting at a public terminal reviewing everything connected to my property. At first, nothing looked unusual. The deed was unchanged. Tax records were current. Ownership records were exactly as they should have been. That was good news. It confirmed nobody had somehow manipulated ownership records during my deployment. Legally, the land remained mine, but ownership wasn't my real question anymore. I wanted to know how construction had been approved, so I shifted my search toward permits. That was where things became interesting. Several construction permits had been issued to the neighboring subdivision during the previous year. Garage structures, parking improvements, drainage modifications, landscaping upgrades. The permits matched exactly what I'd seen on the property. I opened every file I could find. The approved plans included maps, drawings, contractor information, and project descriptions. At first glance, everything looked legitimate. Then I noticed something. The site maps showed the project area ending at the subdivision boundary. According to the paperwork, none of the structures crossed onto my land. Not even close. I leaned back in my chair. That immediately raised a question. If the permits showed the correct boundaries, why had the actual construction ended up on my property? Either someone ignored the approved plans, or there was information missing from the file. Neither possibility was good. One thing became clear very quickly. Many people assume a building permit gives someone unlimited authority to build. It doesn't. A permit simply means a local government has approved certain construction activities. It doesn't transfer ownership. It doesn't erase property lines. And it definitely doesn't grant permission to build on land you don't own. Even if every permit in the world is approved, property rights still matter. That distinction would become important later. After printing several records, I left the county office and drove through the subdivision. I wanted to see how residents reacted when the HOA wasn't standing nearby. The first conversation surprised me. An older resident watering flowers recognized me almost immediately. "I heard you were back," he said. That caught my attention. News apparently traveled fast. We spoke for several minutes. Eventually I asked about the garages. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough to tell me he knew something. A lot of people had questions about that project. "What kind of questions?" I asked. He glanced around before answering. "The location." That was all he said. But it was enough. Someone had noticed. The next few conversations followed a similar pattern. Nobody seemed eager to criticize the HOA directly, but several residents hinted that concerns had been raised during construction. One neighbor mentioned seeing workers measuring the same area multiple times. Another recalled hearing arguments between contractors and project managers. A third resident simply shook his head and said people knew that project was causing problems. The more people I spoke with, the more a pattern emerged. The construction hadn't happened quietly. Questions existed from the beginning. Warnings had been raised. Concerns had circulated. Yet somehow the project continued anyway. That realization pushed me toward another source of information: the contractors. Fortunately, construction crews tend to leave traces behind. Company logos, equipment markings, permit records. It didn't take long to identify several businesses involved in the project. Most refused to discuss details. I couldn't really blame them. Nobody wants to become involved in a legal dispute. But one former subcontractor was willing to talk. We met at a small diner outside town. Nothing formal, just coffee and conversation. At first he was cautious. Then I showed him photographs of the garages. His shoulders dropped slightly, like he'd been expecting this day to arrive. "You aren't the first person to ask questions," he said. That statement immediately got my attention. I asked what he meant. He explained that concerns about boundaries had surfaced during portions of the construction process. Nothing definitive, nothing officially documented, but enough uncertainty that several workers had discussed it among themselves. "What happened?" I asked. He stirred his coffee. "The project kept moving." That answer told me everything I needed to know. Nobody had stopped to verify concerns. Nobody had paused construction. Nobody had demanded clarification. The schedule simply continued. Before leaving, he offered one final observation. The people running that project acted like ownership was already settled. Ownership was already settled. Those words stayed with me the entire drive home, because they suggested something deeper than carelessness. Someone had been operating from a position of certainty. The question was why. That evening I spread documents across my kitchen table: county maps, permit records, photographs, survey information. Pages covered nearly every available surface. For hours I compared records and timelines, construction dates, approval dates, inspection dates. Everything. The more I reviewed, the less this situation looked accidental. Mistakes happen. Survey crews make errors. Contractors misunderstand instructions. Property disputes occur all the time. But mistakes usually create confusion. This situation didn't feel confused. It felt organized, planned, deliberate. Most disturbing of all, nobody involved appeared worried about consequences. That fact kept pulling my attention back to the HOA president. The confidence she displayed wasn't normal. She hadn't reacted like someone caught making a mistake. She'd reacted like someone genuinely shocked that I was questioning her authority. As if my return had disrupted a plan she expected to continue indefinitely. Around midnight, I finally pushed the paperwork aside. I wasn't ready to draw conclusions yet. I still needed evidence, facts, proof. But one realization had become impossible to ignore. The HOA never expected a fight. Somewhere along the way, they convinced themselves that the owner would never challenge what happened. Maybe they assumed deployment meant permanent absence. Maybe they thought the cost of resistance would discourage me. Or maybe they simply believed nobody would stand up to them. Whatever the reason, their decisions reflected complete confidence. And confidence like that usually comes from one of two things: strong evidence or dangerous assumptions. The following morning, my attorney called after reviewing several of the documents I'd collected. His first words immediately caught my attention. "There's more exposure here than they probably realize." I sat down. For the first time since returning home, it felt like the situation was beginning to reveal itself. And if my attorney was right, the garages were only the beginning of the HOA's problems. Up to that point, I'd been focused on gathering information, documents, maps, permits, witness statements. I assumed the HOA was doing the same thing on their end. I was wrong. Less than a week after my confrontation with the HOA president, the retaliation started. The first letter arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning. At first glance, it looked official. Multiple pages, legal language, formal formatting. The sender was the Homeowners Association. I opened it, expecting some kind of explanation regarding the construction project. Instead, I found a list of complaints. According to the letter, my property was creating negative visual impacts for nearby residents. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. Negative visual impacts. The accusation would have been laughable if it weren't so ridiculous. The property had looked essentially the same for years. Nobody had complained before. The timing wasn't exactly subtle. I tossed the letter onto the kitchen table. 2 days later, another one arrived. This time, the association claimed overgrown vegetation was affecting community standards. A few days after that, another notice appeared, then another, and another. Each complaint was different. Each complaint was equally absurd. None of them had anything to do with the garages sitting on my land. Instead, the HOA seemed determined to create as many distractions as possible. The pattern became obvious very quickly. Every time I pushed for answers regarding the encroachment, another complaint appeared. It felt less like enforcement and more like harassment, as if they were trying to bury me under paperwork. At first I ignored it. Then things escalated. One afternoon, a neighbor I'd spoken with during my investigation approached me while I was checking fence lines. The conversation felt awkward from the start. He kept glancing around before speaking. Finally, he lowered his voice. "The board's been talking about you." I wasn't surprised. "What are they saying?" His expression tightened. "Depends on who's listening." That wasn't encouraging. Over the following days, bits and pieces began reaching me. According to rumors circulating through the subdivision, I was supposedly trying to destroy community improvements. Some residents had been told I wanted the garages demolished purely out of spite. Others heard I was planning lawsuits against homeowners. One rumor even claimed I was demanding ownership of HOA property. The stories changed depending on who repeated them, but they all shared one purpose: make me look unreasonable, make me look greedy, make me look like the problem. I couldn't help noticing something. None of the rumors addressed the actual issue. Nobody was discussing why structures existed on private property. Nobody was talking about property boundaries. Nobody was asking how construction crossed legal lines. Instead, attention was being redirected toward my reaction. That tactic is surprisingly common. When facts become difficult to defend, some people shift the conversation entirely. The goal isn't to prove they're right. The goal is to make everyone argue about something else. And unfortunately, it worked on some residents. People who had previously been friendly suddenly became distant. Conversations ended quickly. Waves disappeared. Several neighbors who had shared concerns earlier now avoided discussing the issue altogether. Fear has a way of changing behavior, especially when someone worries about becoming the next target. By the second week, the situation became even stranger. I started noticing vehicles slowing down near my property. Not once, repeatedly. The same vehicles, the same drivers. Sometimes they would stop briefly before moving on. Other times they would simply sit for several minutes, watching. At first I thought I was imagining it. Then I began documenting everything: dates, times, photos, patterns. The evidence accumulated surprisingly fast. Soon after, I discovered cameras. Several new security cameras had appeared near portions of the subdivision bordering my property. Technically, property owners can install cameras on their own land. There isn't anything unusual about that. The unusual part was the direction they were facing: toward me, toward my land, toward areas connected to the dispute. The message felt obvious. Whether the cameras were intended for security or intimidation, they served the same purpose. They reminded me that someone was paying attention. The more pressure the HOA applied, the more I learned about how these organizations actually function. Many people assume an HOA possesses unlimited authority. That's simply not true. Homeowners associations operate through governing documents and local laws. Their powers are defined by rules, contracts, and regulations. Outside those boundaries, their authority becomes extremely limited. In my case, the situation was even simpler. My property wasn't part of the association. Never had been. Which meant their notices carried far less weight than they wanted people to believe. The problem wasn't legal authority. The problem was perception. Many residents assumed the HOA controlled everything. The board relied on that assumption. And judging by their behavior, they expected me to back down eventually. For a while, I considered the possibility myself. Not because they were right, because fighting takes energy. Every day seemed to bring another complication, another accusation, another distraction. I had spent 14 months deployed overseas. I came home expecting peace. Instead, I found myself waking up each morning preparing for conflict. One evening, I sat alone on the tailgate of my truck overlooking the property. The sun was disappearing behind the trees. The garages stood in the distance, a constant reminder of everything happening around me. For the first time since returning home, doubt crept in. Not doubt about ownership. That part was clear. Doubt about whether the fight was worth it. I knew I was right. But being right and winning aren't always the same thing. Plenty of people spend years battling organizations with deeper pockets and more resources. The thought lingered longer than I wanted to admit. Fortunately, not everyone had abandoned me. A few friends checked in regularly. My former caretaker continued helping document activity around the property. Several neighbors quietly shared information whenever something unusual happened. None of them wanted public attention, but their support mattered. They reminded me that not everyone had bought into the HOA's narrative. That support became especially important a few days later. My attorney called late in the afternoon. The tone of his voice immediately caught my attention. It wasn't concern. It wasn't frustration. It was curiosity. The kind lawyers get when they find something unexpected. "I've been reviewing additional records," he said. I waited. Then he added something that made me sit upright. "There may be a bigger issue here than simple encroachment." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I looked out toward the garages. The setting sun reflected off the metal siding. Until then, I'd been focused on property lines, permits, and construction. But the way my attorney said those words told me we were about to move into entirely different territory. And whatever he'd discovered, it sounded like the HOA had made a mistake far larger than they realized. The morning after my attorney's call, I drove straight to his office. By that point, I expected bad news. What I didn't expect was a conference table covered in documents, survey records, permit applications, construction plans, inspection reports, county maps. Several thick folders sat open beside a laptop displaying aerial images of the property. The moment I walked in, my attorney pointed toward a chair. "We need to compare a few things." That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was his expression. For the first time since I returned home, he looked genuinely interested. Not concerned. Interested. The kind of look professionals get when a puzzle finally starts making sense. I sat down. He slid 2 large documents across the table. At first glance, they looked nearly identical. Both were survey maps. Both showed the subdivision. Both showed my property. The differences were so small that most people would never notice them. I certainly wouldn't have. Not without someone pointing them out. My attorney placed a finger near one boundary line. "Look carefully." I leaned forward. For several seconds I couldn't see what he meant. Then it clicked. The line wasn't in the same place. It had been shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough to matter. A few feet here. A few feet there. Tiny adjustments spread across multiple sections. Individually, they seemed insignificant. Collectively, they changed everything. The altered version made the garage project appear legal. The original version showed the structures crossing directly onto my land. I looked up. "You're telling me someone changed the boundary?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." For a moment, the room went quiet. I stared at the 2 surveys. Months of confusion suddenly started making sense. The confidence, the dismissive attitude, the refusal to acknowledge obvious evidence. They weren't operating from accurate information. They were operating from altered information. The next question was obvious. Who made the changes? Unfortunately, that answer wasn't immediately available. But what mattered was that the differences existed at all. Property boundaries aren't suggestions. They're legal facts supported by deeds, surveys, and recorded documents. Changing how those boundaries appear on internal project paperwork can create serious consequences. My attorney began walking me through the timeline. Original surveys existed. Construction plans were created. Modified drawings appeared later. Those modified drawings were circulated during portions of the project approval process. The more we reviewed, the more troubling the situation became. At best, someone had acted with extraordinary negligence. At worst, someone intentionally altered documents to justify construction they knew shouldn't happen. Neither explanation helped the HOA. I asked the obvious question. What does this mean legally? My attorney leaned back. Potentially several things. First came the encroachment issue. That part was already clear. Structures had crossed onto land they didn't own. Then came negligence. If decision-makers failed to verify accurate boundary information before approving construction, they could be held responsible for the consequences. But the third possibility was what caught my attention. Fraud. Not proven. Not yet. But impossible to ignore. Fraud doesn't always involve dramatic movie-style schemes. Sometimes it involves knowingly presenting false information in order to influence decisions. If someone altered documents and relied on those alterations to push a project forward, the legal exposure could increase dramatically. And that was exactly why my attorney suddenly seemed interested. The situation was evolving from a simple property dispute into something much larger. One of the most important distinctions in property law involves the difference between a mistake and willful encroachment. Mistakes happen. A survey crew misreads measurements. A contractor follows incorrect instructions. A property owner misunderstands a boundary. Those situations still create liability, but courts often treat them differently. Willful encroachment is another matter entirely. That's when someone knows, or reasonably should know, that a boundary issue exists and proceeds anyway. The law tends to view those situations far less sympathetically. That distinction stayed in my mind as we continued reviewing evidence, because the deeper we dug, the harder it became to believe this was merely an accident. Then the biggest break in the investigation arrived. A former contractor finally decided to speak openly. Unlike previous conversations, this wasn't a casual discussion over coffee. He brought documents, notes, emails, information he'd apparently been holding on to for months. We met in a small office conference room later that week. At first he seemed nervous. I couldn't blame him. People don't usually volunteer information that might place them in the middle of a legal dispute. But eventually he opened a folder and slid several pages across the table. These were sent during construction. I began reading. The contents immediately caught my attention. Internal communications referenced concerns about property boundaries. Questions had been raised. Measurements had been discussed. Warnings had been mentioned. Nothing screamed conspiracy. But something was undeniable. People involved in the project knew boundary concerns existed. The issue had been identified. It had been discussed. And despite those discussions, construction continued. That single fact changed the entire case. Before, the HOA could claim ignorance. Now that defense looked increasingly difficult. The contractor wasn't finished. He described conversations that occurred during the project. Repeated concerns. Repeated requests for clarification. Repeated assumptions that someone else had already verified the information. The more he talked, the clearer the picture became. Warning signs existed everywhere. Yet nobody with authority chose to stop and investigate. By the time the meeting ended, the evidence felt overwhelming. For weeks, the HOA had acted like they held all the leverage. Now the balance was starting to shift, and apparently they knew it. A few days later, something strange started happening online. Posts began disappearing. Community announcements vanished. Comments that previously criticized me suddenly became unavailable. Entire discussion threads were removed. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then more posts disappeared. Then more. Residents started noticing. Screenshots began circulating privately. People asked questions. Nobody received clear answers. The timing couldn't have been worse for the HOA. The harder they tried to erase the past, the more attention they attracted. Panic has a way of creating new mistakes. And for the first time since returning home, I sensed panic. Not from residents. From leadership. The confidence I'd seen during that first confrontation was beginning to crack. The certainty was fading. The situation was no longer under their control. Every new document seemed to create another problem. Every witness statement created another question. Every deleted post made people more suspicious. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the growing stack of evidence. The same table where I'd previously spread maps and permits now held something far more valuable. Proof. Not assumptions. Not theories. Proof. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to what the HOA had done. I was preparing to respond. My attorney called shortly before sunset. We have enough to make our position clear. I knew exactly what he meant. The investigation phase was ending. The next phase was beginning. A formal demand letter. a document that would outline the encroachment, summarize the evidence, identify damages, and place the HOA on notice. In simple terms, it was the moment everything became official. I looked out the window toward the property. The garages still stood where they shouldn't, but they didn't feel untouchable anymore, because the story was changing. And for the first time since coming home, it felt like the truth was finally catching up to the people who thought they could rewrite it. The following morning, my attorney and I began drafting the letter that would force the HOA to make a choice: fix the problem, or face what came next. The demand letter wasn't the real weapon. That surprised me at first. After weeks of gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, reviewing surveys, and documenting violations, I assumed the demand letter would be the thing that finally got the HOA's attention. My attorney disagreed. "The letter matters," he told me, "but the invoice is what they'll remember." We were sitting in his office reviewing potential outcomes. Several folders containing survey records and contractor statements sat stacked beside us. For the first time since returning home, the conversation wasn't focused on what had happened. It was focused on what the HOA owed. I leaned back in my chair. Owed for what? My attorney slid a legal pad across the desk. "For using your property." The answer sounded simple. The implications were not. Most people understand property ownership in basic terms. You own land. Other people stay off it. But when someone occupies private property without permission, courts often look beyond the physical trespass itself. There can be financial consequences attached to that occupation, especially when the occupation creates value for the person using the land. In this case, the garages weren't sitting empty. They were part of an active HOA improvement project. Residents benefited from them. Vehicles were stored there. Property values were being advertised around them. The association was enjoying advantages created partly by land it didn't own, and that created an entirely different category of damages. My attorney began outlining the strategy. First, we needed to establish the fair value of the occupied land, not the value of the entire property, just the portion being used. That involved comparing similar commercial and storage-related properties in the area, local lease rates, land use values, comparable rental agreements. Nothing exaggerated, nothing unreasonable, just defensible numbers. The calculations took several days. Every figure had to withstand scrutiny. Every assumption needed support. The goal wasn't revenge. The goal was credibility. Eventually, a number emerged, then another, then another. The occupied area generated a daily usage value. Once we established that figure, the next step became obvious. Calculate how long the HOA had been using the land. 8 months, more than 200 days. My attorney multiplied the numbers. Then he turned the paper toward me. I stared at the total. The amount was substantially larger than I expected. And that was before considering additional damages. The legal principle behind it wasn't complicated. If someone occupies land they don't own, they don't get to enjoy that benefit for free. Courts often refer to this as compensation for unauthorized use or occupancy. The exact terminology varies by jurisdiction, but the concept remains similar. The property owner may be entitled to recover the reasonable value of the use that was taken from them. In other words, occupying land can create a bill. And bills have a tendency to grow over time. That was where the daily rate became important. Every additional day the garages remained on my property increased potential exposure. The clock wasn't moving in the HOA's favor. Once the calculations were finalized, my attorney began drafting the invoice. I remember staring at the document when he handed me the first draft. It looked surprisingly ordinary. Professional letterhead, property references, dates, numbers. Yet every line carried weight. The invoice outlined the occupied acreage, the duration of use, the calculated daily value, the retroactive charges, and the continuing daily amount accumulating until the encroachment was resolved. At the bottom sat a total large enough to get anyone's attention. For the first time, the garages had a price tag attached to them. And it wasn't cheap. A week later, we delivered the package. Demand letter, supporting documentation, survey evidence, the invoice, everything. My attorney arranged formal service to ensure there would be no argument about whether the HOA received it. By that point, I had learned enough about the board to know they would challenge anything they could. Documentation mattered. Proof mattered. Details mattered. The package arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I didn't attend the delivery, but I heard about the reaction quickly. Apparently, the initial response wasn't concern. It was laughter. Several board members reportedly treated the invoice like a joke. One resident later described the meeting atmosphere as borderline amused. According to multiple accounts, The HOA president dismissed the entire thing almost immediately. "He's trying to scare us." That was her reported response. Maybe she genuinely believed it. Maybe she needed everyone else to believe it. Either way, the board voted to reject the demand. No payment, no negotiations, no acknowledgement of responsibility, just refusal. When my attorney informed me, I wasn't surprised. People rarely abandon arrogance overnight, especially after months of getting their way. The surprise came later, because rejecting the invoice wasn't the same thing as eliminating the problem. A few days afterward, my attorney sent a follow-up communication clarifying something the board appeared to have overlooked. The invoice represented existing damages. It wasn't necessarily the limit of potential liability. Additional legal costs could emerge. Additional claims could be evaluated. Additional remedies might become available depending on how the dispute progressed. In short, refusing to pay didn't freeze the situation. It simply allowed exposure to continue growing. That clarification landed very differently. The laughter started disappearing. Questions started appearing. Residents who previously ignored the dispute began paying attention. For months, most homeowners had accepted the HOA's version of events. The garages were improvements. The project was beneficial. Everything was under control. Now numbers entered the conversation. Large numbers. Numbers connected to decisions made by leadership. People started asking obvious questions. How much would this cost? Who approved the project? Why weren't concerns investigated earlier? Could homeowners end up paying for mistakes made by the board? Those questions spread quickly. Neighborhood conversations changed. The issue was no longer about one returning property owner. It became a financial concern affecting everyone. Several residents contacted board members seeking explanations. Others attended meetings looking for answers. Few received them. Instead, leadership continued projecting confidence. But confidence becomes harder to maintain when facts keep piling up. By now, even people who knew nothing about surveys understood one thing. The situation wasn't going away. The invoice had accomplished exactly what my attorney predicted. It forced everyone to view the dispute differently. Not as a personal disagreement, not as neighborhood drama, as liability. And liability gets attention. The pressure intensified throughout the following weeks. More residents questioned leadership decisions. More discussions happened behind closed doors. More people started reviewing information for themselves. The HOA president continued insisting everything would be fine, but the certainty she displayed during our first confrontation was becoming increasingly difficult to find. Because every day the garages remained where they were, the numbers continued increasing. The clock kept running, and everyone knew it. One evening, my attorney called after receiving another communication from HOA council. The conversation was brief, but one sentence stood out. "They finally understand you're serious." I walked outside after hanging up. The garages sat in the distance exactly where they'd been for months. Nothing looked different. Yet everything had changed. For the first time since coming home, the HOA wasn't treating the dispute like an annoyance. They weren't treating it like a misunderstanding. And they definitely weren't treating it like something that would simply disappear. They understood there were consequences now. Real consequences. Financial consequences. The kind that couldn't be ignored. The kind that forced difficult conversations. And judging by the sudden change in tone, those conversations were already happening behind closed doors. The public hearing took place 3 weeks after the invoice was delivered. By then, the dispute had become impossible for the HOA to contain. What started as a property disagreement had evolved into the biggest topic in the neighborhood. Residents were talking about it at community events, discussing it in online groups, sharing screenshots, comparing stories. Everyone wanted answers. And eventually, enough pressure built that a public meeting became unavoidable. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at the community clubhouse. I arrived early. Even from the parking lot, I could tell something was different. Cars filled nearly every available space. People stood outside talking in small groups. Others waited near the entrance holding folders and documents. The atmosphere felt tense, not hostile, expectant, like everyone knew something important was about to happen. Inside, nearly every chair was occupied. Residents lined the walls. Late arrivals stood near the back. Board members sat at the front behind long tables arranged beneath the HOA logo. The HOA president occupied the center seat. For months, she'd projected confidence, authority, control. Tonight, I noticed something else. Fatigue. Not panic. Not yet. But definitely strain. The room continued filling until conversations blended into a constant hum. Then the meeting began. At first, the board attempted to handle routine business, budget discussions, maintenance reports, committee updates. Nobody seemed interested. People weren't there for landscaping updates. They were there because of the garages. Eventually, a resident stood up. "When are we discussing the property dispute?" The room immediately fell silent. The HOA president adjusted her microphone. "We're aware of concerns regarding a misunderstanding involving neighboring land." A misunderstanding. The phrase instantly caught my attention. For months, that had been the strategy. Minimize, redirect, reframe. Never acknowledge the actual problem. Several residents exchanged glances. The explanation wasn't landing. The HOA president continued. "Unfortunately, some inaccurate information has circulated." That statement triggered immediate reactions throughout the room. People began whispering. Others shook their heads. The board was still trying to control the narrative. The difference was that fewer people seemed willing to accept it. One resident stood. Did the structures cross onto private property or not? The question hung in the air. Simple, direct, difficult to avoid. The HOA president hesitated. Then she delivered an answer that satisfied nobody. "The situation is more complicated than that." The room erupted with frustration. People wanted facts. Not slogans. Not talking points. Facts. That was when my attorney stood. We had submitted documentation beforehand and received permission to present evidence. The room gradually quieted. A projector screen lowered near the front. For the next 30 minutes, the discussion stopped being about opinions. It became about records. The first image displayed an official survey. Property boundaries appeared clearly on the screen. My attorney explained how license surveys establish legal boundaries. Then he displayed another image, an aerial photograph. The garages, the fence, the driveways. Everyone could see the relationship between the structures and the property lines. The visual impact was immediate. Several residents leaned forward. Others began studying copies of handouts distributed throughout the room. Then came the GPS records. Before deployment, I had preserved survey coordinates and location data connected to the property. Using those records, professional measurements, and county mapping systems, the presentation demonstrated exactly where the construction existed. Not approximately. Exactly. The room grew increasingly quiet. People weren't hearing accusations anymore. They were seeing evidence. Slide after slide reinforced the same conclusion. The structures crossed onto my property. The fence crossed onto my property. The landscaping crossed onto my property. The facts were becoming impossible to ignore. The HOA president attempted several interruptions. Each time, the documents spoke louder than the explanations. Then my attorney displayed something that changed the entire meeting. The project timeline, construction approvals, permit dates, inspection records, everything arranged chronologically. Residents could now follow the sequence for themselves. Questions immediately emerged. If concerns existed, why wasn't construction paused? If boundaries were uncertain, why wasn't clarification requested? If ownership mattered, why wasn't the property owner contacted? The board struggled to provide answers. And then came the witness testimony. The former contractor walked to the front of the room. I could feel tension spread throughout the audience. Until then, most people had only heard from residents and attorneys. Now they were hearing from someone involved in the project itself. He spoke calmly, carefully, professionally. He described concerns raised during construction, questions regarding measurements, conversations about property boundaries, requests for clarification. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just facts, which made the testimony even more powerful. The room listened in complete silence. Then he revealed something that changed everything. Warnings had been raised before construction was completed. Not after. Before, several people visibly reacted. One resident actually lowered his head into his hands. Another looked directly toward the board table. The implication was obvious. This wasn't a situation where nobody knew there might be a problem. Concerns existed. Questions existed. Opportunities to investigate existed. Yet construction continued. The contractor wasn't accusing anyone of criminal behavior. He didn't need to. His testimony established something equally damaging. Professional warnings had been ignored. For months, leadership had portrayed the issue as an unfortunate misunderstanding. That explanation became much harder to believe, especially when multiple opportunities existed to prevent the problem entirely. The atmosphere in the room shifted. I could feel it happening. Residents who had previously defended the board were now asking difficult questions. People wanted explanations, specific explanations, not general statements, not carefully worded responses, real answers. One homeowner stood and addressed the board directly. Were these concerns reported to leadership? No clear answer came. Another resident asked whether independent verification had ever been requested. Again, no clear answer. The silence became more damaging than any response. For years, the HOA leadership had operated with little resistance. Most residents trusted them, assumed they were competent, believed they acted in the community's best interest. That trust was visibly eroding, not because of rumors, because of evidence. The HOA president attempted one final defense. She argued that everyone had acted based on information available at the time. But even that explanation struggled to survive. The documents showed concerns. The testimony showed warnings. The timeline showed opportunities to stop. The room understood exactly what that meant. For the first time since returning home, I wasn't fighting the HOA's narrative alone. Residents were asking the same questions I'd been asking for weeks. The difference was that now they were asking them publicly, and the board had no good answers. As the meeting approached its conclusion, another unexpected development occurred. Several county representatives who had attended as observers requested copies of the documentation presented during the hearing. The request immediately drew attention. Everyone understood the significance. County officials don't typically involve themselves in neighborhood drama, but boundary disputes connected to permits, approvals, and construction records are another matter. The representatives remained professional, careful, measured, yet their interest spoke volumes. The hearing ended shortly afterward. Residents gathered in clusters throughout the room. Conversations continued long after the meeting officially adjourned. People weren't talking about misunderstandings anymore. They were talking about accountability. As I walked toward the exit, my attorney approached. "Did you see that?" I knew exactly what he meant. The county officials, the document requests, the sudden attention. For months, the HOA controlled the situation. Now outside authorities were looking at it, and judging by what had happened inside that room, the board was beginning to realize something dangerous. The problem was no longer limited to a dispute with me. An official investigation was about to begin. The lawsuit became official less than a month after the public hearing. By then, the atmosphere around the subdivision had changed completely. Residents weren't asking whether a problem existed anymore. They were asking how bad it was. The county's interest had intensified. Attorneys on both sides were exchanging documents. Witnesses were being interviewed. Records were being requested. For the first time since returning home, it felt like the situation was moving toward a final answer. The courtroom wasn't nearly as dramatic as television makes it look. No cheering crowds. No dramatic music. Just polished wood, stacks of paperwork, and people whose decisions carried real consequences. Yet somehow that made it feel even more serious. Because unlike the HOA meetings, nobody inside that room cared about politics. Nobody cared about popularity. Nobody cared about excuses. Only evidence mattered. The hearing lasted several days. During that time, hundreds of pages of documents were introduced. Survey records, permit files, property maps, photographs, email communications, contractor statements. Every piece of information collected during the previous months was finally being placed under a microscope. The HOA's legal team attempted to frame the situation as a misunderstanding. According to their argument, the construction resulted from confusion regarding boundaries and project approvals. It was the same explanation they had repeated for months. The problem was that the evidence had continued growing. And evidence doesn't care about narratives. One of the first topics discussed involved encroachment remedies. Most people assume that when someone builds on another person's property, the solution is automatic demolition. In reality, courts often examine several possible remedies: financial compensation, property restoration, removal orders, in some situations negotiated easements. The specific outcome usually depends on the facts of the case. Courts tend to consider how the encroachment occurred, whether it was intentional, and what consequences are necessary to make the property owner whole again. That distinction became important because the HOA's defense relied heavily on the idea that this had been an innocent mistake. If they could convince the court that the situation resulted from confusion, their liability might be reduced. Unfortunately for them, the evidence wasn't helping. The survey records came first. Professional surveyors testified regarding the original property boundaries. They explained how monuments had been placed, how measurements were verified, how legal descriptions connected directly to recorded deeds. Their testimony was detailed and technical. More importantly, it was consistent. Every survey pointed to the same conclusion. The structures occupied land that belonged to me. Not approximately, not potentially, definitely. The physical evidence alone created significant problems for the HOA. Then the document analysis entered the record. The altered drawings that had first surfaced during our investigation were displayed in court. Side-by-side comparisons appeared on large monitors. Original versions, modified versions, boundary differences highlighted for everyone to see. Watching the presentation felt strangely surreal. Months earlier, I had stared at those same records trying to understand what happened. Now the entire courtroom was seeing them. The differences that once seemed subtle suddenly looked impossible to ignore. Experts explained how the altered versions changed the appearance of the project area, how those alterations affected decision-making, how inaccurate representations could influence approvals. The HOA's attorneys objected repeatedly. They challenged interpretations, questioned conclusions, attempted alternative explanations. But each challenge seemed to create another problem, because every answer generated additional questions. Questions the HOA leadership struggled to address. Then came the witness testimony. The former contractor took the stand. Unlike the public hearing, this testimony occurred under oath. The room felt noticeably quieter as questioning began. He described concerns raised during construction, discussions regarding measurements, requests for clarification, warnings that boundaries might not be where some project managers believed. His testimony remained calm and professional. That made it even more effective. He wasn't trying to win an argument. He was simply describing what happened. Several additional witnesses supported portions of his account. Different people, different perspectives. Yet similar themes emerged. Questions existed. Warnings existed. Opportunities to investigate existed. Construction continued anyway. The pattern became increasingly difficult to dismiss. As proceedings continued, something unexpected happened. The HOA president's own statements started creating problems for the defense. Earlier communications were introduced, meeting records, public comments, written responses. Statements that might have sounded harmless months earlier now appeared alongside contradictory evidence. One example after another revealed inconsistencies. At times, explanations shifted, dates changed, descriptions evolved. Each contradiction chipped away at credibility. The judge noticed. Everyone noticed. By the third day of testimony, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt completely different. At the beginning of the case, the HOA still appeared confident. By now, that confidence had visibly faded. The board members sitting behind their attorneys looked exhausted. The HOA president spent most of her time staring at documents rather than making eye contact with anyone. Months of certainty were collapsing under scrutiny, and the evidence wasn't finished. County representatives eventually provided findings from their own review. Their testimony focused primarily on records, approvals, and procedural concerns. The details were technical. The conclusion was not. Multiple opportunities existed to identify the boundary issue before construction reached completion. Those opportunities were missed. That statement landed heavily, because it reinforced everything we'd been arguing from the beginning. This wasn't one isolated mistake. It was a chain of ignored warnings, ignored questions, ignored responsibilities. Finally, after days of testimony and argument, closing statements concluded. Then came the waiting. Anyone who's been involved in litigation knows waiting can be the hardest part. The evidence had been presented. The arguments had been made. Nothing remained except the decision. Several weeks later, the ruling arrived. The courtroom was packed. Residents filled available seats. Attorneys reviewed notes. Reporters occupied portions of the gallery. Even before the judge entered, the tension felt overwhelming. Then the room stood. The judge took the bench, and everything became silent. The ruling lasted nearly an hour. The judge reviewed the evidence methodically. Survey records, witness testimony, construction timelines, document alterations, county findings, one category after another. Every major issue addressed. Every major argument evaluated. The further the ruling progressed, the clearer the outcome became. The court rejected the HOA's claim that the situation resulted solely from innocent confusion. The judge specifically referenced repeated opportunities to identify and correct the problem. Warnings existed. Questions existed. Evidence existed. Yet construction proceeded. Then came the moment nobody in the room would forget. The judge looked directly toward the HOA representatives. The rights of a property owner do not disappear because that owner is temporarily absent. The statement cut through the room like a knife. Months of excuses collapsed into a single sentence. Deployment didn't erase ownership. Distance didn't erase ownership. Silence didn't erase ownership. The land remained mine the entire time. The court ultimately found the HOA liable, not just for the encroachment itself, for the consequences that followed. The ruling included removal of the structures occupying my property, compensation for unauthorized use, recovery of legal expenses, additional financial damages connected to the dispute. The exact numbers mattered, but the principle mattered more. The court had officially recognized what the HOA spent months denying. They had no right to use my land. When the ruling ended, the room remained silent for several seconds. Nobody seemed quite sure how to react. The HOA president looked stunned. Several board members sat motionless. Residents exchanged looks that seemed part disbelief and part relief. As for me, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not anger, relief. The fight was finally over. Or at least the legal part was. A few days later, I drove toward the property early in the morning. As I approached the entrance, I saw something parked near the garages. Large yellow machines, excavators, heavy equipment. Contractors were already preparing the site. The court had spoken. The removal order was real. And for the first time since returning home, I was looking at the beginning of the end. Because the structures that never should have existed were finally about to come down. The demolition started on a cold Monday morning. I arrived before sunrise. A thin layer of fog hung over the property, drifting across the open ground where the garages stood. For a moment, everything looked peaceful. Then the machinery started moving. The deep rumble of diesel engines echoed through the air. Excavators rolled into position. Work crews unloaded equipment. Supervisors reviewed plans. The process that had taken months to reach was finally beginning. And judging by the number of vehicles lining the nearby road, I wasn't the only person who wanted to see it. Residents from the subdivision had gathered throughout the morning. Some stood near the entrance. Others watched from their vehicles. A few brought folding chairs. The turnout surprised me. But after everything that had happened, maybe it shouldn't have. The dispute had dominated community conversations for months. People wanted to witness the ending. By 8 o'clock, the first excavator moved forward. The machine paused briefly near one of the garages. Then the operator lowered the hydraulic arm. Metal groaned. Support beams bent, and within seconds, the first section of the structure collapsed. The sound carried across the property. Nobody said a word. The crowd simply watched. For months, those buildings had represented arrogance, entitlement, the belief that powerful people could take something that didn't belong to them and never face consequences. Now they were coming apart piece by piece. One wall at a time, one beam at a time, one mistake at a time. I expected to feel excitement. Instead, I felt calm, almost detached. The real battle had already happened. The evidence, the hearings, the court proceedings. Those were the difficult parts. This was simply the result. By mid-morning, half of the largest garage had been reduced to twisted metal and broken concrete. The visual impact was impossible to ignore. What once looked permanent suddenly appeared fragile, temporary, like it had never belonged there in the first place. Several residents approached me throughout the day. Most simply wanted to talk. Others wanted to apologize. One older homeowner stood beside me watching the demolition for several minutes before speaking. I should have questioned things sooner. His voice carried genuine regret. I appreciated the honesty. The truth was, many residents had trusted the board. That's what communities are supposed to do. People elect leadership because they assume those leaders will act responsibly. Most homeowners weren't survey experts. Most didn't know construction details. They relied on information provided to them. Unfortunately, that trust had been abused. As demolition continued, the consequences for HOA leadership were becoming impossible to avoid. The court ruling had created more than financial liability. It had created accountability. Within weeks of the judgment, multiple board members resigned. Some left voluntarily. Others faced growing pressure from residents demanding change. The HOA president lasted longer than most, but not by much. Every meeting became a struggle. Every explanation raised new questions. Every attempt to defend previous decisions only reminded people how the situation had happened in the first place. Eventually, she resigned as well. The announcement wasn't dramatic. No emotional speech. No public defense. Just a brief statement and an empty chair. For years, she'd operated from a position of authority. Now that authority was gone. The fallout extended beyond resignations. Insurance carriers became involved. Financial reviews were conducted. Outside consultants examined governance procedures. Attorneys continued sorting through the aftermath. The exact financial consequences took months to calculate completely. But one thing became clear immediately. The dispute was expensive, far more expensive than simply respecting property boundaries from the beginning. Meanwhile, the community itself started changing. Without the old leadership controlling every conversation, residents began speaking more openly. New candidates stepped forward. People who previously avoided HOA politics suddenly became interested in participation. A special election was eventually scheduled. The turnout was the highest in years. When the results were announced, most of the previous leadership structure had been replaced. The new board immediately promised greater transparency, better oversight, independent review of major projects. Whether every promise would be fulfilled remained to be seen. But the shift in attitude was undeniable. For the first time in a long time, residents seemed hopeful. Not divided, not angry, hopeful. One afternoon, several weeks after demolition began, I received an unexpected visit. A small group of neighbors stopped by the property. Some of them had avoided me during the worst parts of the dispute. Others had believed the rumors circulating through the subdivision. None of that mattered much anymore. What mattered was what happened next. They apologized. Not because anyone forced them to, because they wanted to. We talked for nearly an hour. About the dispute. About the community. About how quickly misinformation can spread when people stop asking questions. The conversation felt surprisingly normal. For months, nearly every interaction had involved conflict, accusations, tension, suspicion. Now there was none of that. Just neighbors talking. By the time demolition crews finished their work, the property looked dramatically different. The garages were gone. The unauthorized fencing was gone. The landscaping that crossed onto my land was gone. Even the noise felt different, quieter, lighter, as if the property itself could finally breathe again. A restoration crew spent additional weeks repairing damaged portions of the land. Concrete was removed. Ground was regraded. Vegetation was replanted. Slowly, the scars began fading. One evening, after most of the restoration work had been completed, I walked across the property alone. The sun was setting behind the trees. The same trees I'd spent years imagining before deployment. The same land I'd worried about overseas. The same land that had nearly been taken from me. I stopped near the center clearing where I planned to build my cabin someday. The view felt familiar again. Not perfect, but familiar. For the first time since returning home, there were no letters waiting in my mailbox, no hearings on the calendar, no attorneys expecting phone calls, no investigations demanding attention. The fight was finally over. I stood there for several minutes listening to the wind move through the trees, and for the first time in a very long time, the property felt exactly the way it was supposed to feel. Mine. As the last light disappeared across the horizon, I looked over the restored acreage and realized something. The land wasn't just legally mine again. It had finally become home again. A few months after the demolition crews left, life finally became quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty. The kind that feels earned. The property had started looking like itself again. Grass covered areas that had once been buried beneath concrete. New trees had been planted where equipment had damaged the landscape. The restoration work was nearly complete. Most importantly, the constant stress that had followed me since returning home was finally gone. For the first time in a very long time, I could focus on the future instead of the fight. Looking back now, it's strange how different challenges teach different lessons. Deployment taught me resilience. When you're thousands of miles from home, dealing with uncertainty becomes part of daily life. You learn to adapt. You learn to function under pressure. You learn how to keep moving forward even when circumstances aren't ideal. Those lessons helped me overseas, but they weren't the lessons that carried me through this battle. The property dispute taught me something different: persistence. Because resilience helps you survive difficult situations. Persistence helps you finish them. There were plenty of moments when walking away would have been easier, moments when accepting a compromise would have been less stressful, moments when ignoring the problem would have saved time and money. But every time I considered those options, I kept returning to the same question. If someone can take your property simply because you're absent, what stops them from doing it to someone else? That question became bigger than the garages, bigger than the HOA, bigger than me. Because the truth is, abuse of authority often survives for one reason. People become convinced that challenging it isn't worth the effort. That's how small problems become larger ones. That's how entitlement grows. That's how rules start applying differently depending on who's involved. The HOA leadership counted on that mindset. They assumed I would calculate the cost of fighting and decide it wasn't worth it. Maybe that strategy had worked before. Maybe other people had backed down. Maybe other people had accepted decisions they knew were wrong because challenging them felt impossible. This time it didn't work. And that's a lesson I hope every viewer takes from this story. Standing your ground doesn't always guarantee victory, but surrendering guarantees defeat. That doesn't mean every disagreement needs a lawsuit. It doesn't mean every conflict requires a battle. What it means is that rights only matter when people are willing to defend them. Property rights, personal rights, community standards, accountability. None of those things maintain themselves. They require people willing to speak up when something isn't right. Fortunately, the outcome extended beyond my property. The community changed as well. The new HOA board followed through on many of the promises made during the election. Major construction projects now required independent reviews. Boundary verification became mandatory before approval of large developments. Financial oversight procedures were strengthened. Residents gained greater access to board records and decision-making processes. Were all the problems solved overnight? Of course not. No community works that way. But progress happened. Real progress. And for many homeowners, that progress restored confidence that had been damaged during the dispute. Ironically, the very conflict that divided the neighborhood eventually helped improve it. People became more involved, more informed, more willing to ask questions. And that's usually a good thing. As for me, I finally turned my attention back toward the plans that existed long before the fight ever started. The cabin. For years, that idea had existed only in sketches, notes, and daydreams. Now it was becoming real. The first foundation work began shortly after the restoration project ended. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, just a simple structure built exactly where I'd always planned to put it. Sometimes I'd sit on the property and watch the construction crews work. The experience felt completely different from watching the unauthorized garages go up. This time, every decision involved permission, planning, respect, ownership. The way things should have been from the beginning. As the cabin slowly took shape, I found myself thinking less about the dispute and more about what came next. Family gatherings, weekend cookouts, friends visiting from out of town. Simple moments that had nothing to do with attorneys, courtrooms, or HOA meetings. The future I imagined years earlier was finally returning. One morning, not long after construction started, I arrived at the property before sunrise. The air was cool. The sky was still dark. A light breeze moved through the trees. I walked toward the clearing and stopped near the spot where the garages had once stood. There was no evidence they had ever existed. No concrete, no fencing, no metal structures, just open land. The same open land I'd purchased years earlier. As the sun slowly rose above the horizon, golden light spread across the property. The pond reflected the sky. Birds moved through the tree line. The entire landscape seemed peaceful. For several minutes, I simply stood there. No phone calls, no meetings, no deadlines, no conflict, just silence. The kind of silence I'd spent 14 months thinking about while overseas. The kind of silence that had motivated me to buy the property in the first place. That moment felt like victory. Not because I won a lawsuit, not because the HOA lost, because peace had returned. And peace was always the goal. The garages were gone. The land was restored. The future was waiting. What more could I ask for? Before I finish this story, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare? Would you have accepted a settlement if you were in my position? And what do you think should have happened to the HOA leadership after everything they put the community through? Let me know in the comments. I read far more of them than you might think. And if you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates a good property rights victory. Because stories like this happen more often than most people realize. And sometimes the only thing standing between losing something important and protecting it is the willingness to keep fighting one day longer than the other side expects. They thought deployment meant I was gone forever. They forgot one important thing. The land was still mine. And eventually every inch of it came back home with me.